Hi, I'm Mo Ajlali, President of Mindful Leader and your host for the Mindfulness at Work Summit. For this session, we'll be talking to Dan Goleman. Dan Goleman, best known for his worldwide bestseller Emotional Intelligence, is most recently co-author of Altered Traits: Science Reveals How Meditation Changes Your Mind, Brain, and Body. A frequent speaker to businesses of all kinds and sizes, Goleman has worked with leaders around the globe examining the way social and emotional competencies impact the bottom line. Welcome, Dan.
Pleasure to be here, Mo. Thanks.
It's so exciting to have you part of this, and I'm just going to share a really quick, brief story about how I got introduced to your work. Years ago, I was running a small company. We were growing quickly. I was pretty much an asshole leader. I can't think of a quicker way to describe it. Pushing forward, and I remember a buddy of mine who ran a sales company. We were in a meeting once. He's like, "You really need to read this book, Emotional Intelligence." I looked at it and I was like, "Emotional intelligence? Like, why in the world would I read this?" Fast forward 5 years later, the company had collapsed. I found myself trying to explore, make sense of life and why am I here? And I turned back to it, and it blew me away and really helped spur my journey towards this exploration of mindful leadership. So deep gratitude for you and just that impact that book had. And I wonder, a lot of folks still out there probably look at that, and a lot more now are accepting it, but still are wondering, why emotional intelligence? And
Well, when I first saw the phrase emotional intelligence, which by the way, I didn't invent, I just made it well known. I thought, oh, what an oxymoron. Those two things don't go together. That's your first reaction. Then I realized, actually, it means you can be intelligent about emotions, that that emotions are always part of whatever we're doing. We may think we're being rational. We may think we're being analytical, but actually the way the brain is arranged, emotions are enmeshed with everything we think and everything we do. And so emotional intelligence is a tool for helping us manage the emotional part of what's going on anyway, well, so we can be effective, so we can be productive, so we can be compassionate, whatever it is our goal might be.
Beautiful. And I'm curious, it's been widely adopted. Everyone, this term emotional intelligence is accepted in the business world, and there's still some pushback. I know a couple of years ago, Adam Grant had put out that article and was sort of examining emotional intelligence and questioning it, and curious what your sense is of how well adopted it's been, and any response to Adam Grant and some of the criticism.
Yeah, well, I just got back from Romania. Before that, I was in Nashville. Both places wanted to know about emotional intelligence and leadership. In Nashville, I was talking to people who manage wealth, who are advisors to people of great wealth, and they realize it's a relationship business. And if it's a relationship business, then you need to be good at emotional intelligence. That's going to help you connect. It's going to help people trust you. In Romania, I get at Kazakhstan, it's worldwide, and it's business everywhere. And I think what happened is that people intuitively understood that, oh yeah, it's always been that when you think about the worst boss, the boss everybody hates, and the boss everybody loves, you're talking about emotional intelligence, that dimension. And so Adam Grant, I remember that article. Adam had not really looked at updated research. He was basing what he said on outdated studies. Emotional intelligence as a concept has been around for about 20 years. It's been well studied maybe in the last 5 or 10. And the first studies didn't really have very good data, but he looked at the first studies. He didn't look at the most recent. And the more recent ones make a very strong case that effectiveness, performance correlates very highly with emotional intelligence, which was what I'd always been arguing, but didn't yet have the data for.
And before we jump into exploring this, some of the work that recently you've been doing around emotional intelligence, I'm curious if you could speak to our audience a little bit about your background with meditation and mindfulness. Obviously, Altered Traits, and people saw you and Jon Kabat-Zinn and Richie Davidson together.
Right. So when I was a graduate student in clinical psychology at Harvard, I got a Harvard pre-doctoral traveling fellowship to go to India. And I was interested in seeing what meditation could do. I started meditating as an anxious undergraduate, and I found it really helped me. And I thought, there's something here and something probably important for clinical practice. It's my main interest then. And so I spent a year and a half in India, and I met some really extraordinary beings, people who were more equanimous, more loving, more present than anyone I'd ever met in the West. And they all were, yogis or lamas. They were basically professionals in meditation. They had dedicated their lives to it. And when I came back to Harvard, I did my dissertation on meditation as an intervention in stress reactivity. Richard Davidson, who was a fellow graduate student, did his on how meditation sharpens attention. Back then, there are only 3 peer-review articles we could cite in our dissertations that had been done on meditation. Now there's 6,000. And Richie, as we call him, who's a very close friend of mine, continued in neuroscience. He's at the University of Wisconsin. He has a lab with 100 people. He's got dedicated fMRIs and, all of this equipment. And he's flown over what you might call Olympic level meditators. And he finds their brains are really different. And when we looked at the 60 best studies out of 6,000, we find that there's basically a dose-response relationship. The more you do, the larger and deeper the benefits become. Although with mindfulness, for example, they start right at the beginning. We were actually surprised how early you can pick up sharpening of attention, which was something he had suspected way back when. Now the data is very solid. Or the ability to handle stress better, which is what I had suspected, and now it's been verified by dozens of converging studies that, for example, with stress, if something comes along that upsets you, fewer things upset you. You get less upset and you recover more quickly, which is really ideal. You don't want to be like a zombie. You don't want to be unresponsive, but when you do respond, you don't want to be captured by that response. You want to be able to get on with the next thing. And with attention, with mindfulness, for example, right at the beginning, people become more concentrated. They're better able to multitask, which is a huge challenge to attention today. And people are better able to remember. Students do better on exams because of this. So the benefits start at the beginning, but they increase steadily as you go along.
Wonderful. And for me, I remember when I read Emotional Intelligence, I got it. And there was this sense of knowing, but then kind of moving into doing was very difficult. And I think for a lot of folks. And so this sense of understanding what emotional intelligence is and all the benefits, but how does it actually show up? And it wasn't until my meditation practice that I started to sort of cultivate, I think, some of the basics that would allow me to even deepen my EQ. And I want to talk about an article that you had out in Harvard Business Review. Without EQ, mindfulness doesn't work. And I'm curious if we could talk about that. And then I'm curious, is the reverse true? Without mindfulness, can you have EQ? Because there's a certain sense of self-awareness.
Good question. So what we meant wasn't that mindfulness doesn't do anything. Of course it works. It does enhance attention. It does enhance your ability to handle stress. But what we were talking about was the final outcome of enhanced performance at work. And what we found, and this is the research of Matt Lippincott, who's working with me in the coaching application for emotional intelligence, we'll talk about in a little bit. So Matt saw that people who did mindfulness did have those benefits, but if they're going to have a bump up in performance, they also needed to enhance a particular competence or set of competencies that led to that enhanced performance. That's what the emotional intelligence, at least my model of emotional intelligence shows, is that between mindfulness and the general capacity to be self-aware, to manage yourself well, and enhance performance, there's a black box. And in that box are competencies like, for example, how well you handle stress, whether you keep your eye on the goal or not. These are learned and learnable abilities that pay off in terms of work performance or leadership. And so mindfulness gives you a boost, there's no question. But in order to actually get the maximum bang for the buck, so to speak, you need to go on and learn the intricacies and the how of these particular competencies. And by the way, let me add one thing. We think that mindfulness helps a lot in that learning. For one thing, you become better at monitoring yourself, noticing what your thoughts are, what your feelings are, and this can help you change a habit. It helps you learn the new way of doing things, the better way, or how to enhance what you're doing already. So I think mindfulness plays a role. Can you have emotional intelligence without mindfulness? No, I think mindfulness is built into emotional intelligence. It's a foundation. It just doesn't have the elaboration that you need for further boost in performance.
I see. In the article, there was a couple other things that you mentioned that really stood out for me. And one was, I feel like when people meditate or they practice mindfulness, it's a very individual kind of self-focused thing. Whereas with emotional intelligence, there was talk of 360 feedback, others to help identify your blind spots, and the sense of just external perspective.
Yeah, and you know, much of my writing has been the what and the why of emotional intelligence. Now we're getting into the how, and one of the very important aspects of how is to realize that self-awareness alone isn't going to clear up your blind spots, because it doesn't help you see them. But what does help you see them is 360 feedback. For those folks who may not be familiar with the 360, the best 360s have behavioral measures, things other people can see about you. I have one called the Emotional and Social Competence Inventory, the ESCI 360, that has all behavioral indicators. And you fill it out, you do a self-rating, and then you give it to, say, 10 people who you respect, who know you well, whose opinions you trust, and they rate you anonymously. And that data is aggregated. You get a single lump score from everyone else. But it gives you a profile. Remember, there are 12 emotional intelligence competencies. So you might be good in one set and not so good in another. And if you match that with your own self-awareness, the gap, or your own self-rating, the gap between how you rate yourself and how other people rate you is actually a measure of blind spots, of self-awareness or a lack of it. So if you're spot on, if you evaluate yourself the same way other people see you, hooray, that means that you have really good self-awareness. If you didn't know that you don't have empathy, everybody else knew. That's not so good, but it gives you a place to start working.
It's funny. I just recall I did a very rudimentary 360 feedback in the company I mentioned before I read Emotional Intelligence.
Oh, really?
And I remember one of the anonymous feedback was that I was a dictator, and it blew my mind because I didn't see myself that way.
Right.
And I feel like with mindfulness and just practicing sort of this acceptance, like being able to accept the feedback is really, really important.
Very important, yeah. And mindfulness can help you there too, because you can catch yourself. You can say, oh, I'm doing that thing again. But remember the feedback. Or, you know, we really recommend coaching or working with other people, because they can keep reminding you and help you find new ways to do things that are comfortable for you, that at first might seem forced, but will later become very natural.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And so I'm curious to explore these 12 competencies. And,
sure.
And if I could pull up a graphic from your website here to just give us a visual aid.
Oh, yeah. So this graphic, so this is from the website KeyStep, one word, keystepmedia.com. And this is my updated model of emotional intelligence. There are the 4 components: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. My original model had 5 parts. Motivation was also there, but we folded it into self-management. Statistically, that seemed to work well. And let me just walk you through it, Mo, if that's okay, just briefly. So emotional self-awareness, this is really key to everything else. If you don't have self-awareness, you're going to have blind spots about first of all, what you're doing or what you're not doing well. Like you said, people saw you as a dictator. You had no idea. And all of us have some blind spot or others. That's why 360 is very useful for starting. So emotional self-awareness also means I know what I'm feeling and why. I know what I'm thinking because of that. I know how that impacts my performance. And this is really key because, you know, if you want to improve your performance, you have to understand what may be getting in the way or what's facilitating it. There's another dimension of self-awareness, which I think is increasingly important. That has to do with, what does this all mean? What's my purpose here? What matters to me? And self-awareness is going to help you sense that too. Then if you skip over to the self-management, using those inner messages, like, uh-oh, I'm starting to get a little hijacked here, I'm getting a little angry or getting a little scared, that applies self-awareness, and then you can manage yourself better. So emotional self-control doesn't mean squelching emotions. You want to have positive emotions. You want to have your passion, but you don't want to have emotions that are disabling, that get in the way. And those are the ones that you can see coming, that you can then short circuit more effectively. Adaptability, this is a kind of a no-brainer. It turns out that, you know, things are shifting quicker than ever now in the world. You know, the technology is changing and trends are coming and going and so on. And you have to be able to adapt in today's workplace. But a surprise here was that when my colleague, Richard Boyatzis at Case Western, assessed adaptability in his MBA students and then tracked them down 7 years later, or even longer, maybe 10, 14 years later, he found that high adaptability predicted life success and satisfaction. This is life satisfaction as well as career success. So it's kind of a sleeper competence, but extremely important both in the short term and it turns out in the long term. We didn't realize that.
And Dan, I'm curious about adaptability. People often now are talking about resilience, and so would that kind of fall in the same category?
I'd say that adaptability is the same as what people are calling agility these days. And resilience is part of the emotional self-management, the self-control. Resilience, in technically speaking, in brain science, means the time it takes you to recover from your peak upset to being really functional again. And people who are highly resilient have a very short recovery time. They do it very quickly. They snap back. Good question. Achievement orientation has to do with getting your goals, keeping your eye fixed on where you're going, no matter the distractions, the obstacles, always coming back to that. And this is really key in not only the business world today, I think in life today. And then positive outlook. No matter what happens, things are going to go wrong. But do you become completely bummed out and give up? Or do you look at the bright side? You know, things can turn around, or maybe one door closes, another door opens. In other words, there's this basic attitude that things can always be better. And that's that positive outlook. And it helps us get through tough times. It's also very motivational. So keeping your eye on the goal and staying positive are the two motivational self-management competencies that we have. Then if you go over to social awareness, the keystone here is empathy. Empathy is mindfulness of the other person. It's being able to tune in to what that other person is sensing, thinking, feeling, knowing where they're at. People who kind of have what's called an I-it attitude to other people, treat other people as objects. They don't tune into their feelings. They don't tune into their intentions, to what it is, how they're reacting in the moment. And so they're off in connection. But empathy, being in rapport with another person, which empathy allows, lets you have chemistry. It lets things go well, no matter what the relationship might be.
And Dan, just for folks who might not be clear, the difference between empathy and sympathy would be what?
Well, sympathy is feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is just knowing how they feel and using that so that you can deal with them effectively. Sympathy it gets you in another direction. And also sympathy is in a way more about you than about the other person. In sympathy, you're trying to do what you think is going to make the other person feel better, but it's about what you think you should do. Empathy is actually a tuning and then being spot on in how you respond. At another level now, organizationally, awareness of, for example, in your organization, if you want to get a decision made, who do you need to influence? Who makes that decision? Who do you need to go to? That's one of the key things that organizational helps you with. It also helps you stay in touch with the unstated ground rules or maybe the mission of the organization, so you can align with that or see how it fits you, or maybe it doesn't fit you, but at least you have a sense of what the overarching goal is of all of this that we're doing together, as well as that in the moment sense of how are we being together? How do we want to be together? Then there's the relationship management group. This is the most obvious, most visible set, I would say. Influence. So this is knowing, for example, if you're going, how to persuade a given person, how to help them get on the same page that you're on. And in tandem with organizational awareness, it's very powerful because you not only know who makes the decisions, but you know how to best influence them to the extent you can.
Dan, I'm just curious, with organizational awareness, would you say that's the same as situational awareness? I know people.
Well, unpack what you mean by situational awareness.
So it's just a term that's often used in terms of just being in an environment and just being in tune with all the different factors that sort of perception and sort of.
Yes. I think that's a combination of empathy and organizational awareness. For example, if you go to a new culture, situational awareness is vital. And people who have empathy are able to pick up the unspoken ground rules of a new culture more quickly than other people. And that helps you be appropriate to the situation instead of being, off kilter. And that is really important. More and more people are getting overseas assignments. And there's data that shows that if you have empathy, particularly what's called cognitive empathy, you know how people think about things, you can articulate ground rules, you pick up other cultures much more quickly than other people do.
And I could imagine just even in the workplace where you have multiple generations that almost have their own very distinct cultures that could come in handy even domestically.
Oh yeah, and it's not just the situation, but it's the people who are in the situation. And if you're with a group of millennials versus a group of senior execs who are much older, the way you act might be very different in between each of those groups, or it's subtly different, but different in a way which creates a connection with either group. And being adaptable about how you do that is very important because it means that you get along with everyone, not just one subgroup at work. And then conflict management, pretty self-evident. This comes up a lot, for example, in teams. The most high-performing teams, one of the things they do is they don't let conflict simmer. They deal with the issues explicitly. But conflict management also means being adept at, for example, helping people air their differences and come up with a resolution that both people feel is fair and this is really important, that actually strengthens the relationship of those two people. One of the goals of conflict management isn't just to handle this particular issue, but to make sure that people aren't divided because of it. But in fact, maybe they can become closer because they worked it out. Mm-hmm. And this gets to the teamwork. There's really good research by a woman named Vanessa Druskat at the University of New Hampshire on teams, and she's shown that emotional intelligence works at the team level, and she can assess it, she can measure it at the team level. And the higher the emotional intelligence of a team, the greater their performance. And she's got all kinds of outcome metrics for this. It's really strong relationship. But one of the ways that emotional intelligence shows up in a team is in self-awareness. There's a collective self-awareness. People are able to trust each other, to be candid with each other. They know their own strengths and their own limits. They know when, Max should come in or Sue should come in and do that other thing, this thing, because that's not my strength. That's her strength or his strength. So they're able to match a challenge with the person on the team who's best suited for it. That's one of the many ways in which emotional intelligence shows up in teams. And also there's the question of how good a team member are you as an individual? And here being able to empathize, being able to adapt, being able to get along, to connect. All of these emotional intelligence skills make people outstanding team members. Being inspiring as a leader, actually interesting, it draws on that self-awareness, because you want to be able to feel what is authentic to you, what really feels right, and how could you articulate that in a way where you have a shared goal that speaks to other people, to their heart to heart, so to speak. So that's the most inspiring, and it creates a very positive emotional climate. People feel motivated, they feel engaged, they feel that what they're doing is good work. And it takes that inspirational articulation, I think, to cement that. Then finally, there's being a coach and a mentor. This is often overlooked by leaders who are kind of, time pressed. I've got so many things to do. But taking time to have a conversation with a direct report, for example, or a colleague about, what do you want from life? What do you want from your career? What do you want from this job? What are you looking for? It's a very deep conversation. It's not about the job, it's about the person. And it makes you very close and creates, for example, if you're that person's boss, it's going to create a real loyalty. And one of the things that we're doing in our the programs we're rolling out is helping executives be better at the coach and mentor competence, because it's vital to people feeling you're a great person to work for, but it's so often overlooked.
And I could imagine, as we're moving away from sort of command and control, kind of hierarchical management style,
sure,
that people need to learn new skills.
Well, the command and control style was great in the 50s. Look at Mad Men. But, today it just doesn't make it. In fact, it creates a negative emotional climate. A lot of research is showing that. And the things that help a leader be a leader who's liked, who people want to work for, are being able to inspire, being a coach and a mentor, having a good time with people, being in flow with them, asking their opinions when you're making a decision, being a consensus leader. These all create positive outcomes. Command and control, not so good.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, with all these different competencies, do you offer practices or ways for people to cultivate these and sort of measure?
Yeah, we have a kind of graded program. In the fall, we're rolling out an online learning platform where anybody can learn these competencies, understand what's behind them, the brain basis even, and then you can opt to go through with a coach. Someone who looks at you and will ask you to do a 360 and help you decide what you want to work on and help you get better. We also are bringing this into companies. A lot of HR people are interested in have been interested in emotional intelligence for a long time. And there's so many programs out there already. I just don't know what they are or what they're doing. So I felt, okay, it's about time I did one that I'd feel confidence in and I can sign my name to. So we're doing that. We're helping executives become coaches, not just coach and mentor, but coaches in general, so that they can help people develop any of these 12 competencies. And then we have a coaching certification program. All of these, I think you'll put the URL on your website, but they're all at keystepmedia.com. And whatever one appeals to you, you can check it out.
And I'm curious, back to when you mentioned the team, just the thought occurred to me, there's a lot of talk about emotional contagion, right? So when people show up with certain emotions, it affects everyone around them. I wonder if people who have, and then there's also the sense of leadership presence, like, certain leaders walk in a room and they sort of have this aura that affects people around them. Is that something that you see with EQ, like people who have sort of high EQ affect the team?
When you have a leader with presence, when you have a leader that people tune into, who makes them feel, like secure, calm, trusting, you have a leader with high emotional intelligence. And in fact, this is one of the things that we coach for. And I think mindfulness can help leaders get into that space. So I think mindfulness kind of weaves into many of these, although, as I said before, I don't think mindfulness in and of itself is sufficient to master a competence, but it probably is necessary for most or all of them. There's something else, by the way, Mo, that we haven't talked about, and that's an attitude of concern, caring, or loving kindness. Mindfulness, classically, in its traditional form, always was accompanied by what's called loving kindness practice, where you wish yourself well, people you care about, people you know, and then even strangers, people you don't know. And that turns out, there's some research coming out of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. This seems to strengthen a particular circuit in the brain, which is the parental caretaking circuit. It's a parent's love for a child. But what you're doing is generalizing that to everybody. And this is the basis of a particular kind of empathy, which is empathic concern. So when you have a leader that people love to work for, it's probably a leader who has that capacity, who communicates not just presence, but caring. So you can trust me, I've got your back. It doesn't mean I'm not going to give you negative feedback when you need it. You need constant performance feedback. I forgot to say that the achievement competence is, people with that competence love performance feedback right now in the moment, because they want to do a mid-course correction. They want to know, am I doing well or am I not doing well?
And I think what comes up for me is I know, having kind of gone through a bit of a journey myself, that often it's like I'll notice that, the tone that I'm saying this in is off, and I'll notice like, ooh, I wish I had said that differently. And it's a learning process, and it's incredibly difficult, because when you're in a leadership position, your learning could have a real effect on others. I mean, it's really tough. But often, like, the things that would help correct those things are, you have to be proactive about it. And so just this loving kindness meditation could help in sort of a deeper way make adjustments that will appear when you're in those crisis situations.
I think what it does is prime you, so you're more ready to show caring and be, which people pick up as, oh, I can trust that guy, I can trust her. So people, your direct reports feel better about you as a leader. That's really important. There's this classic research at the Yale School of Management where a leader is in a bad mood and people on the team catch that bad mood and performance goes down. And a leader's in a positive mood, emotional contagion, they catch that mood, performance goes up. So people are attuned, very finely attuned to a leader, and it cues the group. And it's natural. In any human group, people pay most attention to and put most importance on what the most powerful person in that group says or does. So you can't help but set the tone if you're the leader of the group. And it's important to remember that and be mindful of that.
And I'm curious, just another question comes up. This is another thing that challenges me. This idea of being an authentic leader and being true to, whatever's occurring, while at the same time knowing that, what you do, say, and show could impact everyone. So how do you find a balance there?
Well, this is why I encourage leaders to work on themselves, to be centered, to have emotional balance, to have empathy. In other words, this is why the emotional intelligence competencies matter so much, because if you have that, then authentically you will be the leader that people want to have.
Beautiful. And any other tips or suggestions for how people might be able to prime themselves for some of these competencies, or any sort of practices or exercises?
Sure. Well, for one thing, it takes focusing on it. We emphasize focus, which mindfulness, of course, enhances directly in the learning process. And another is to get, however you can, an objective assessment of where you're great and where you could use a little help, because you want to focus on where you can use a little help, but also where you're inclined to bother. You want to be motivated. You want to ask yourself, do I really care about it? Do I want to be more empathic? Well, do you want to be a better listener? That's a very concrete behavior, whether people feel they're heard or not. And it's kind of the common cold of mismanagement today. People are rushed, and they cut people off. And so do you want to hear people out, really be present? If you do, then it helps to have someone who's going to walk you through that, help you rehearse it, be with you and there for you on the day you blow it. This is the coach or learning partner getting some help. And then practicing at every opportunity. This is crucial, that you realize the brain doesn't distinguish much between work and the rest of your life. You can practice on your teenager as well as your colleague. But if you keep doing that, there's that general maxim that the more hours you put into it, the more mastery you'll have. What that's about really is what's called neuroplasticity. You're actually strengthening new circuitry in the brain for the new way of behaving. And you want to get so that the new thing happens automatically without you having to be mindful, like, oh, I better practice that new thing.
So it's second nature and just
exactly. Yeah.
It's funny, as you were talking and you shared that this is not only affects the workplace, I was thinking about conflict management and some of the things you're saying about that between me and my wife. I've got 2 kids under 2 years old. And
oh man,
all this stuff comes up at home.
Well, just remember, if you have 2 kids under 2 years old, they have no prefrontal cortex. It's growing. And in fact, when you see developmental changes in a kid, you're actually watching the growth of the brain as an organ. The brain is the last part of the body to become anatomically mature. It doesn't mature till the mid-20s. So give them a little slack, but also give them guidance, set boundaries. That's important. And praise them when they do well.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And it's funny, a lot of the parenting and relationship techniques I see being really applicable in the workplace in certain ways.
Well, if you get more emotionally intelligent at work, your spouse is going to be happy.
That's right. You'll be easier to live with.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Any closing thoughts or final thoughts that you'd like to explore in the time we have together?
Well, I think we covered all of the main bases. And it's always a pleasure to be here with you, Mo. Thank you so much for having me.
Dan, this has been great. Thank you for being part of the Mindfulness at Work Summit. This has been fantastic. We'll post the link so people could learn more, and we'll also post this graphic for folks so they could have it right there as they check out the session.
On that point, there actually is a set of primers that unpack each of those 12 that you can get that a key step too. So if any of those, hit home with you or sing to you, like, oh yeah, I'd like to know more about teamwork or empathy or whatever, you can get the primer for that.
You're saying the primer is pocket size, small, so people could have it
Carry it with you, remind yourself. Yeah, a lot of people are doing that these days.
Awesome. Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks again, Dan.
Okay, Mo.
And that's the end of our session. I'm Mo Ijlali. Thank you for joining us.